We have really got to change farming and food culture, absolutely. But we can't do that if we just focus on agriculture and food. We've got to dig deeper than that and get down to the underlying economy and the governance that puts the economy in place, and the science that drives the present technology, and the morality that defines what it is we're actually trying to do, and indeed the sort of metaphysics, which is all about the spirituality, what is our attitude to the universe, and so on and so on. And unless we think very broadly along all those lines, then we're never going to make the changes we really need to do. And this book is a summary, as I see things. I've been looking at this for 50 years, so is what we really is the ideas that we really need to put in place and act upon. So that's it. That's what we're about.
Lovely, Colin. I think you don't need me really, but if I could direct the conversation a little bit, I guess everybody knows Colin and he needs no introduction. I imagine that you might have done that before I arrived. So, Colin, I just wanted to kick off by saying early on in the book, you compare and contrast the different roles of reform, revolution, and renaissance, all as possible routes to change. So could you tell us a bit more about those and why you favour renaissance, or a rethink, as you put it in your book title, is needed?
Yeah, sure. Well, those three things, reform, renaissance, and revolution, are the three ways in which society is in practice changed. Now, reform is in a sense the easy way, because you just change little things, you tweak, you make incremental changes, and you hope that over time the incremental changes will do what's needed. And reform is not trivial. I mean, there has been several reforms in the history of the world that have made a huge difference, like making slavery illegal. It's huge, and it's a reform. And women's suffrage, another huge step forward, which is just a reform superimposed on what was there already, although all these things have huge repercussions, of course. But at the moment, we're in such a mess that we're not going to get where we need to be in the time just by making incremental changes. And furthermore, there is no plausible route that will take us step by step from where we are to where we need to be. In other words, if we're going to make the kind of changes that we need to make, we need to be radical. We need to get right down to the roots and really rethink from first principles. Now, this leads us to the second main way of changing things, or historically the main way, which is revolution. The trouble with revolution, it more or less generally says you start with a sort of clean slate. You absolutely sort of wipe the current system off the map. What do you call it? A scorched earth policy, really, and start again from nothing. Revolutions in practice are violent. They don't have to be, but they usually are. And they're very, very difficult to control. So you never really know when you start where it's going to finish up. So I personally absolutely don't recommend revolution, which is just as well because it's not going to happen on a big scale. I don't see you can avoid revolutions here and there because people get desperate and protest and so on. Activism also necessary, but big scale revolution is not going to do what we want, and it's not going to happen anyway. And that leaves us with the third option, which is what I'm calling renaissance. It is renaissance. And what renaissance says, it takes up on an adage that has been ascribed to Gandhi. I don't know whether Gandhi ever actually said it, but the idea is that you become or you create the world that you want to see, and you create it in situ without necessarily, or preferably without, upsetting the status quo too much. But you build the alternative, and then you start with lots of little initiatives and you coordinate them to make a kind of network. You start with little lifeboats, and eventually the lifeboats become an alternative landmass where people who are enmeshed in the present system, they've got somewhere to go to if they decide to jump ship, just to change the metaphors a bit. And so we rebuild for first principles is the thing, the whole thing. We do it, people at large. We don't wait for government to do it. We do it. We don't wait for big business to do it, because they're not going to do it. We, people at large, what I call ordinary Joes and Joes, have to make the Renaissance happen for ourselves. And the Renaissance has to be absolutely across the board. We have to rethink everything and restructure where necessary, but don't restructure where not necessary. If it ain't bust, don't fix it, is the way forward. And Renaissance, of course, literally means rebirth. And although we've got to rethink everything, you've got to start somewhere. And the best place in practice to begin is with food and agriculture. So the Renaissance that we really need now must begin with the agrarian Renaissance, reconstructing farming and rethinking it. And the good news, because there is good news really, is that this is already happening. There are already thousands and thousands and thousands of farmers out there who are already doing the kind of things that need doing. And there's quite a few people, not enough, but quite a few townies or non-farmers who want to join in and are beginning to join in and beginning to do the things that need doing. So my book is about what Renaissance involves.
That's great, Colin. And I think, we've had a few of those voices, well, more than a few at this conference this week, people who are already getting on with it. But I would like to hear from the horse's mouth, so to speak. You use the term enlightened agriculture. Now, I think you've hinted, by what you've just said as to what that might involve, but what would be your definition of enlightened agriculture?
Yeah. Well, just to be historical, this is what politicians do. They always go back. Anyway, I first started writing about this stuff in the 1970s in a book called The Famine Business. And I said, what we've got is agriculture that is run by big business, and that's not what we need. What we need, I said, is what in those days I called rational agriculture, which is roughly what I now mean by enlightened agriculture. The trouble with the term rational agriculture is that such is the modern mindset that people assumed that rational meant whatever is profitable. If it makes money, it's rational. If it doesn't make money, it's not rational, so don't do it. So I thought, no, that's the opposite of what I want to say. So I came up about 10 years ago, or more than that, perhaps 20 years ago, with the expression enlightened agriculture. And some people thought enlightened agriculture was too long, so we shortened it for public purposes, to real farming, hence the Oxford Real Farming Conference. Now, the way to define real farming, I like to define it informally, because informal definitions are much better than big legal things. So it is farming that is expressly designed to provide good food for everyone, everywhere, forever, without cruelty, without injustice, and without wrecking the rest of the world. And the good news is that if we just did simple things well, that would be eminently possible. And one of the things about present day hunger and famine and all the other nasty things that we're facing, and wreckage of the biosphere in producing food, all that's completely unnecessary. It's entirely caused by the system. And if we just did simple things well, we could overcome all those problems. Most people would think that producing good food without wrecking the rest of the world is what agriculture is for. But in the minds of the people who run the world, governments and big business, that's not what it's for at all. Enlightened agriculture is a new expression, real farming, but it's based on two principles that are really very well established, which I certainly didn't think up. And one of them is agroecology, and the other is food sovereignty. And agroecology means simply treating a farm as if it were an ecosystem. And food sovereignty, in essence, it's quite complicated in detail, but in essence, it just means that every society should have control over its own food supply. So that's enlightened agriculture. Now, the kind of agriculture we have now in a country like Britain, and the kind of agriculture that governments and big business are pushing, and they, of course, are the people with real power, plus the financiers. They're the people with the real power. The kind that they're pushing is not designed expressly to provide good food, and it's certainly not designed expressly to look after the living world, the biosphere. It is designed to maximize wealth in the short term, and also, although this is not made explicit, to concentrate that wealth in fewer and fewer hands. It's entirely driven by the desire to make lots and lots of money. And that's the essence of the economic system known as neoliberalism, where you compete in the world market, everybody head against head, to maximize your own profit and your own share of the market. The kind of agriculture that the government favors is sometimes called conventional, or it's high tech, and it's said to be science-led and all those things like that. Fancy terms. It should not be called conventional. It should be called neoliberal industrial, because that's what it is. It's agriculture reduced to manufacture and pushed into the economic framework of neoliberalism. That's a disaster. It's more or less the opposite of what we really need. That kind of agriculture, as is all too obvious, is completely unsustainable. It's contributing on quite a large scale to global warming. It's the main cause, if you boil it down, of mass extinction, which is real, and it is destroying traditional societies and ways of life. It's a disaster, but that is what the official policy is. Agriculture geared to money and not geared to what agriculture should be geared to.
Yeah, well, I don't think you'll find anyone at this conference who doesn't agree with you on that, Colin. I can see why you moved away from the word rational, because unfortunately, when the powers that be give us these messages about modern high-tech farming, GM farming is all needed to feed the world.
Yeah.
So we get told that, and that sounds quite rational and logical. And if people don't see the system behind all of that, so what can we do about that?
Well, there we are. Here we come back to the principle of renaissance. We've got to create farms of an agroecological kind. In other words, farms that emulate nature and do what nature does. We don't emulate everything that nature does, because nature does some very bad things like earthquakes and tsunamis and all that stuff. But it does the things that are essential, and the essential things are that agriculture has to be sustainable, has to go on and on, and it has to be resilient. In other words, it has to be able to change direction if conditions change. And if they change too much and it's pushed off course, it has to be able to bounce back to where it was before. Now, nature, wild nature, is wonderfully sustainable and wonderfully resilient. I mean, it's been in place for the last 4.5 billion, no, not 4.5, about 4 billion years, which is quite long enough, thank you very much. My point is that if we farmed properly along the lines of enlightened agriculture, we, the human race, together with most of our fellow creatures, could still be here in 1 million years' time. And we should be thinking about the next 1 million years. As things are, a whole raft of intellectuals and well-meaning people, including popes and archbishops and scientists and all sorts of activists, are telling us quite reasonably that we'll be lucky to get to the end of the present century in a tolerable form. Next few decades is the best we can really hope for before we start to implode. And yet, if we did things properly, we should be thinking about the next 1 million years at least. Now, if you ask, what does an enlightened farm look like? What does an agroecological farm look like? Well, it is an imitation of nature at its best. And if you look at nature at its best and you ask, how it manages to be so sustainable and how it manages to be so resilient, you find it has several characteristics. However varied the ecosystems may be, they all share these characteristics. They tend to be maximally diverse. Now, if you translate that into farming terms, that means you're talking about mixed farms. Each species that's in the farm should be as maximally genetically diverse as is reasonable. I mean, you can't always ensure genetic diversity, because a lot of things like potatoes and apple trees tend to be clones, which means they're certainly not diverse. But basically, you want the individual species to be as diverse as possible genetically. You want to the whole system should be low input. I mean, at the moment, the inputs into agriculture, massive inputs of fertilizer and insecticide and all the rest of the other pesticides, all oil dependent. We want to reduce that as much as possible. We want to be low input, and that means, as far as possible, as far as is reasonable, we want to be organic farming. Everything on the farm should be integrated as far as possible with everything else, so that for example, the British farms of the 1950s illustrated this kind of thing very well, where you got whey from the milk, which you were making cheese. You got the whey and you fed it to the pigs, and you had pigs and you fed them on the barley that was grown on farm, etc., etc., etc. And you had horticulture as well. It was an integrated system. And that's another thing that we've got to get back to. And that's again what you see in wild nature. You see integration, everything feeds into everything else in a positive kind of way. And again, you come back to the point that this kind of farming, the agroecological farming, is almost the precise opposite of what the neoliberal industrial farming requires. Because neoliberal industrial farming is designed to maximize wealth, etc., etc. The way to do that, so long as oil is cheap, or at least is affordable, is to maximize the inputs so that you maximize the production, and you get rid of labor because that's expensive, and you replace it with machinery. Machinery doesn't do complexity, so you want the thing to be simpler and simpler and simpler. So you come down to the idea that you need, and also machinery likes of the large scale. So you come back to the idea that instead of small scale farms that are very diverse with lots of farmers, you want big monocultures with, if preferably, zero labor, which of course with robots and all the rest of it is becoming more and more possible. Again, I mean, the point is that it's the exact opposite of what we actually need.
Yeah, thank you, Colin. I'm conscious of the time, so this is my penultimate question, but it's quite a big one, which is, you've described that simplification of agriculture, getting to bigger and bigger farms and machinery, etc. It's kind of a one size fits all. And you could say that there are parallels with, of course, with our economic systems that have got rid of small scale and local, or depressed that, and we've got increasingly globalization. So what do you say to those who say we can't afford this type of agriculture, and people, what about the poor people who can't afford this type of produce? What kind of economic system would support the sort of enlightened agriculture that you envisage?
Well, there's sort of three levels of discussing this thing, really. I think the first is that at the moment it's kind of assumed that what we do in life, well, not just farming but everything else, has to be geared to the economy. And there are lots of people who think that the economy has to be neoliberal, has to be a global competition to make most money. Lots of very good economists, as well as sensible people in general, and the very good economists include, for example, John Maynard Keynes and Galbraith, people like that, have said, look, actually the economy, we shouldn't be gearing our lives to the economy. We should be defining what it is we want in life, what we want to achieve, and then designing the economy to support what we actually want to happen. So we need an economy that will actually support enlightened agriculture. Then we come to the point that enlightened agriculture, as you suggest, because it's labor intensive or skills intensive is a much better term, and very complicated and all those things, it does at the moment, and because oil is cheap, it does at the moment, on the whole, a lot of the food produced by enlightened farms is dearer than the kind of stuff produced by industrial farms and sold in supermarkets. So people say, well, anybody that's going down the kind of route that I'm advocating, and lots of other people are advocating, is just an elitist, middle class and all that stuff. And it's never going to be more than niche because of that. And if you're really responsible, you'd be really concerned about the poor, and you'd be trying to produce it as cheaply as possible. And that is realistic, and that is morally right. You can turn that whole argument on its head and say, no, look, come on, the reason that many people in this country, let alone the whole world, but even in this country, can't afford good food, good fresh food, is nothing actually to do with the price of food. It's everything to do with the way the economy as a whole is structured. And one very simple statistic, which Simon Fairley drew attention to, he created the magazine called The Land, which everybody should read. He said 60, 70 years ago, people at large, like my parents, I was around then, 60, 70 years ago, spent something like 10% of their income on a house and about 30% of their income on food. Nowadays, he said, and of course it's right, it's entirely the other way around. People have to spend 30% or even half of their total income on a house and only 10% on food. Now that's ridiculous. I mean, one of the things there is that most of the money that we spend on houses actually goes to bankers. It's part of the whole system which draws money from society as a whole and puts it into the hands of a very few people. Whereas if we're spending 30% of our income on food, a great deal of that goes to the farmers. In other words, it goes to people who actually do some work. Now, that's been the shift over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the last point is that at the moment, the economy is hugely unequal. So that some people in this country, like the top few percent, earn literally 1,000 times more than the poorest people, the lowest few percent. I mean, the poorest people in this country will earn a few thousand a year, which isn't enough to live on. But the richest people in the world will earn a few million a year, which is 1,000 times more. Now, if you say then, look, food is essential, we've got to spend a certain amount of our income on that. Well, 10% of the average is too small for rich people to notice. I mean, 10% of my income to a billionaire, he wouldn't notice it. Petty cash, less. Whereas 10% of my income for somebody that's on less than a living wage is probably half their whole income. And they've still got to buy trainers for their kids and all that kind of stuff. So it's so long as you've got this kind of unequal, I mean, grossly unequal economy, you can never fix a price of food that is sensible and equitable. So unless you really restructure the economy, you're never going to get it right. And the last point there is that the kind of agriculture, the kind of economy that we really need, which I discuss in my book, I'll show it again, The Great Rethink. It seems to be back to front. Is that how it is? Oh. Is what many people, including me, are calling green economic democracy. And it's based basically on what some people are calling the tripartite mixed economy. You have public ownership, basically government ownership, you have private ownership, and you have, very importantly, community ownership, or what's it called? Anyway, community ownership will do. where communities own farms and communities own shops and so on and so on and so on. None of them is a panacea, but they all have their strengths and you need to use them all together. If you have a doctrine or ideology which says only private ownership is good, which is what the present Tories do, no good. Or you have one which the sort of extreme left advocate, which is only public ownership will do, no good at all. And both of them neglect the whole idea of community ownership. So this is the kind of economic structure that we need to build on. There's quite a literature on this now, and that's where I think one of the most essential things we've got to start tackling. Excuse me.
That's fantastic, Colin. Thank you. And I think I'm mindful of the time, and the virtual bar is open with the Land Workers Alliance, which is hard for any of us to compete with. But you certainly have competed tonight, I think, because you've illustrated perfectly, particularly in that last piece, about why we need system change and why we have to address different parts of this interconnected web, which has got us to where we are today. And so we can't just ignore the other bits. We have to be aware of those. And I'm really pleased that your book is addressing it and helping us. I think you've actually answered my last question, which was going to be, what is the one thing that you suggest we do? But I actually think everybody needs to go away and read your book.
They do. But
yes.
One other little thing I will say is what we're doing on our own behalf. Various people in the session before this one, the one with Andy Middleton,
Yes.
said we need to coordinate and all that stuff. Well, when I say we, I mean I and Ruth and other people, are setting up what we're calling the College for Real Farming and Food Culture, which is designed to sort of develop all the necessary ideas and to spread the necessary ideas. And part of that is the whole business of coordination and cooperation between the various faculties and various people.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I think we'll all keep a very eager eye on the development of that college, which I think I was at the Oxford Real Food and Farming Conference when you announced that. So yes, very exciting initiative. And I just want to say thank you again for giving up your valuable time. I hope everybody will go away and read the book. We've been plugging the title after many of the sessions. And thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference and your evenings.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.